All right, we're going to sort of pick right up there where we left off and do a very similar thing, but I want to talk about an idea called overloading. So we're going to use overloading to do this next problem. It's three methods. The first method is to draw a line of any number of ampersand signs, the amp sign. Then we're going to write a similar method that doesn't have any parameters and always draws a line of 10 ampersands. So that's going to be like the default. Then we're going to write another method that has two parameters and draws an array, n by m array of ampersands. So you can see it's similar to the last problem, but instead of stars, I'm using ampersands, and I'm going to use a method, well, I'm going to use a process called overloading of my methods. Okay, so we'll do a new class, and I'll call it ampersand. I feel like we already did a thing called ampersands. Let's call it ampersand overloading. Public static void main, finish. I was thinking of changing it to like amp overloading, but that's okay. I'm going to close stars, open up this ampersand overloading. Where'd it go? Oh, for some reason my Eclipse is being funny. So you can just, if yours is doing that, you can just move that part over here, and there it is. It keeps opening my new programs over here for some reason. There we go. I think I fixed it. You can always go to, if your Eclipse starts being weird, I think it's under Window, maybe under Show View or Preferences. Somewhere, reset perspective. So you can reset the perspective, and I think that just goes back to the defaults where you want it to be. I'm gonna do that now. Okay, so we're in here in overload. We're gonna put our function declaration, our class commenting up here. My name, today's date. You're gonna fill in the date. Computer science 142. This program will use overloading to write methods. The program doesn't write methods. To draw sets of ampersands. Let me open that back up. I might put one more return right there between the comment and the class header. Okay, now I can close those out. So there's my main function, and I'm going to first write a method to draw a line of n ampersand. So this is very similar to the one that we just did. The last video, public static void, we'll call it line of amps. And it'll have a single parameter, an integer n. And in this function, we will just, or in this method, we will just run a loop for integer I starting at 1, going up to and including n, increasing by 1. Remember that plus plus means I equals I plus 1. It's just shorthand for that code. And then we're going to print a single ampersand. Quote, ampersand, unquote. And again, I know this is a print statement, which is going to end at the end of the ampersands, and I'm going to want to move us down to the next line. So that's going to happen outside this loop because I want ampersand, 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 and then to the next line. So outside that loop, but still inside of this method, I use this shortcut SYSO, control space, just put an empty print line. Okay, so there's no way to know if this function is working unless we test it. So I will call the function here, line of amps. And again, really, literally, this is the same function that we did as line of stars, except it prints an ampersand instead of, oh, can't send an end there. I got to send something. Let's call 7. Okay, and we'll run this. And there's my output of 7 ampersands. Great. Okay, so the next problem says, so let's write that as number 1. Method with single parameter to print line of stars, line of amps. Let's just put the symbol in there. The next problem says, write a method with no parameters that draws 10 ampersands. So one way to do this would just be to let's get that comment in there. Method that draws a line of 10, or 10 here is the default, ampersands. So again, I'm going to set it up the same way. Public, static, void. So here's where the overloading comes in. Line of amps. The same function or method name, but with no parameters in the function header. So this is what one thing that Java allows us to do, is to utilize the same function name, but this will recognize this as a different function because it has different parameters. Either the type or quantity of parameters are different. So in this function, I could rewrite this loop. Integer I equals 1, I less than or equal to, in this case, 10, I plus plus. And then within this loop, we could just, again, have a print statement that prints a single ampersand. And then similar to the last method, outside that loop, we're going to want an empty print statement, print line statement, excuse me. Notice I don't need to put anything in there. It'll print it automatically, print an empty line. So if I run this guy, well, I have to call that function. So let's just get rid of this 7 here. And well, I'll leave the 7. Let's just call it again, so you can see it both happening. Line of with no parameter, line of amps with no parameters. And it should draw a line of 7 from the first functional call, and then a line of 10 from the second functional call, or method call. Sometimes when you have the 10 here like a default, you could declare we could declare a constant up here. Public static final, we call it default. We need integer in front of it. Default equals 10. And then where I have the 10 in this thing here, I would just say default. And that would allow me to, utilize this default somewhere else in the code. And then if I change the default, it would change it. So later on, I could say, oh, you know what, that default really needs to be 50. And then if I were using that 10 or that default value anywhere else, it would change it here, but also it would do it everywhere else. And I'd be saving myself from having to look up and figure out where that 10 is, that default value of 10 is everywhere else. Okay, there's also something else that we could do to make this easier, which is if we look at this second function, this overloaded function, this loop is really this, same 3 lines of code. So instead of recoding the same code here, in this second function that's using the default of 10, I can just call line of amps. This is a very common thing that happens in Java. and send it the default value, or 10 if you prefer. I could put 10 here. And so the line of amps with the default of 10 will call the line of amps that has a parameter and just send in the parameter 10 there. Or even better, use the constant, or use the constant or the final, the default value. So maybe I change this to default, and then in here I put there's 10 of them, so that if the default changes, then the default is the thing that's important, not the 10. Okay, and then back over here, there's one more. So we want to write a method with 2 parameters to draw an array, an n by m array of ampersands. So again, we're going to overload this function again. Method with 2 parameters that prints an n by m array of ampersands. Notice I don't want my comments to go too far. I also don't want my screen. My Eclipse does not need to be the full size of the window. I want to use like half. I want my screen. I only want my Eclipse window to be about that wide. I don't know if that translates well, but you generally don't use the full width of the screen. Maybe you use about 1/3 of it, or a little more than 1/3. So maybe about half. Notice I have 2 lines of code here, so maybe I'll put this inside of a block comment instead. Doesn't matter. Okay, and then here's the method. So public static void. I'm going to call it the same thing, line of amps. Now that's a little bit weird because it's not a line anymore. It's going to be an array, but I'm going to use the same name so you can to illustrate the overloading. Integer n, comma integer m. So maybe instead of the name line of amps, maybe we should call this draw ampersands. So I'm going to actually show you a trick. We're going to highlight line of amps here, and we're going to go to refactor in Eclipse. And I think it's about halfway down. Let's see. Rename. That's at the top. Sorry. In refactor, I want to rename this variable. And I want to rename it as draw amps. T-R-A-W. And then I'm going to hit tab or enter, press enter to refactor. Enter. So it changed the function call here to draw amps, and it also changed, just the one with the 1 parameter. So I actually have to change them all. I thought I was going to do them all, but because they have different parameters, it recognizes them, again, the overloading, it recognizes them as different. So I need to rename the other one. Again, that's up in draw amps. And what it does is it renames it everywhere when you do this. So I changed it here, but it also changed it down here. And if I had called it anywhere else, it would also change it there. This one I haven't called anywhere yet, so we'll just change it here. Draw amps. And let me show you where that was again. It was up under refactor and then rename. Okay, and then in this method, so let's see. The n is the rows, so that's coming down. So we want a loop that runs n times. For integer I equals 1, I less than or equal to n, I plus plus. And then again, just like before, to print 1 row, I can call the other function draw amps. So here, instead of making another loop, I'm just going to call draw amps and send in the variable m as my parameter. So this is a little interesting. If you think about the terminology here, these are formal parameters, n and m, in this function declaration for the function draw amps with 2 parameters. But then when I call this function draw amps with 1 parameter, this m goes from being a formal parameter to an actual parameter. And then I could go back up here, and then it comes in here as n, oddly enough. So it doesn't change the value. So when I call this function in main, let's call it with, let's put a print line here just to break this up. And then we'll call draw amps. We'll go 5 by 6. So now the actual parameters are 5 and 6. They get passed up into here. These m and n here are called formal parameters, but then the m takes on the value of 6. That 6 goes here as an actual parameter. It goes up here into a formal parameter. That's now 6. That's a 6. So that 6 and this 5 are different n's. Something to think about. Okay. And there they are, 5 rows and 6 columns, 5 by 6. Okay, so that problem, or these problems, are illustrating 2 things. One, that we can define functions that have the same name but different parameters, either a different number of parameters or different types of parameters. And that's called overloading. And that could cause problems in your logic if it can cause issues because it can be hard to track what's going on sometimes. But it also can be very convenient. So it's a nice tool to have. And this is illustrating that. And then it's also illustrating this idea that the default one with no parameter can then call the other one. This one calls this one and lets it do the work. And then same thing with the array one, the double array. It calls the initial one and lets it do the work. Now, suppose I wanted to have the default do a 10 by 10 array. I can't have both. I can't have no parameters for a single line and then have one parameter for this double one. It can't do that. So like it can't achieve everything with this overloading, but you can have some fun with it. Let's go and look at spacing. So I have this extra white space here, so I'll just take that out. And then I should have closed, closed, closed. That's all good. I have one space there. If you can go back to your code and sort of tighten up your methods so that I don't have any spaces in there, white space, but I do have a white space after. It makes it easier to read the code. Same thing in here, white space, main, followed by a white space. Okay, I think that's it for this guy. Where does that move us into chapter 3? From here, we're going to look at, I'll leave it this way, other stuff, more stuff. No, we need to look at how do we, objects for chapter 3, and then how do we get input from the user so that the user can tell us how many of these ampersands to draw, or how big the array should be, or you get input from the user to help us write interactive code.